Well, hi everyone. You ever been to one of these escape rooms where you think you've got it all figured out only to discover that there's a hidden door behind what looked like a solid wall and you're convinced that you're trapped and time is running out and then suddenly click, the wall swings open to reveal a whole new room that you never saw coming? Well, that's exactly what happened to a woman named Naomi. And if you'd met her just a little while ago, you would have encountered someone who had given up on happy endings. Her husband was dead. Both of her sons were gone. She was broke and bitter and convinced that God had turned his back on her. If Naomi's life was a movie, everyone in the theater would have been checking their watches, wondering when the tragedy would mercifully end. But here's what Naomi didn't know, and what we often forget when we're in the middle of our own dark chapters. God specializes in plot twists. Just when the story seems hopeless, just when we're ready to write the end on our dreams, God has a way of revealing hidden doors that we never saw coming. Hopefully you've enjoyed this month's journey through the book of Ruth called Plot Twist. And isn't the word of God just spectacular? As always, I would encourage you to find your way into the pages of this life-giving book that we have of the scriptures every single day. God will meet you there through his Holy Spirit, and he promises to. And I pray that you've grown spiritually during our study of this little literary treasure in the Old Testament. It started with a family in Bethlehem who was faced with the hardship of a famine in the land, and they ran away from God. Instead of running toward him, they fled to a pagan nation. They experienced the consequences of that abandonment. All the men in the family die, and Naomi is left alone, far from home, in a godless society with two pagan daughters-in-law. When she decides to return to Bethlehem, so that she might at least die among her people, one of her daughters, Ruth, decides to come with her. Now, as an immigrant and a widow, life would be very hard for the two of them. They had no means for provision or security, and they faced a life of certain poverty. But here's where God's plot twist begins to unfold. The two women return to Bethlehem. Naomi's too old to remake her life, and on top of it, her attitude toward God had really tanked. But Ruth, she, full of faith, went out to glean grain from around the edges of a nearby field, and God's providential hand was upon them, as a wealthy landowner named Boaz took an interest in protecting Ruth and Naomi. And it so happened that he was a relative, and because of a provision in the Old Testament law, he was qualified to be what was called a kinsman redeemer. He was able to step in and purchase Naomi's original property and take Ruth to be his wife. And not only would their original land be returned to them, but all of Boaz's wealth would become theirs, and Naomi's family line would continue, and he and Ruth could conceive a child. So Boaz redeemed them. He bought them back. And we noticed last week how this story brilliantly points us to Jesus, our true kinsman redeemer, who became one of our kin so that he could purchase us back, not with silver or gold, but at the cost of his own life. We are Naomi, is what we concluded. And so we left off with Boaz doing some nifty negotiations to position himself as the leading kinsman redeemer so that he could marry Ruth and so redeem Naomi and her family. And we're going to read the ending of the story today and then do some reflection on the book as a whole. And we're going to drill down specifically on Naomi's surprising journey toward joy. But before we dive into our text today, let me just remind you of the final piece of our care tool that we've been building throughout this series. The tool goes along with our Dream Disciple role called Intentional Friend. We thought, what better time than the summer months to work on being better friends to our friends and neighbors. And so we've been saying that intentional friends care, and it stands for C, connect, time and presence, assist, lend a helping hand, remember, with gifts and moments, and then encourage, words that build. And today I want to encourage us to be encouragers, to use words that build people up. Words are very powerful. Remember, God created worlds with words, and he still heals hearts through words. Paul urged us to encourage one another and build each other up. And sometimes the most powerful plot twist in someone's life comes through a friend who refuses to let them stay stuck in a wrong story about themselves. So what would it look like for you to encourage a friend this week? Text them a quick note of gratitude for something they did, or write a note acknowledging something that you admire about them. Be an encourager this week. All right. We're going to pick up our story in 4:13, and I want you to listen how this passage is just loaded with foreshadowing. Ruth 4:13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. And may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him." And then Naomi took the child and she laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And so they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so Naomi's story has sure taken some turns, from bitter and angry to doting grandmother. And I want to point out a few insights embedded in this little section before we get to some lessons about joy. First, I just want you to notice, hopefully you did, the hints of Jesus. Look at 14. There's that word redeemer again. And then it says, may his name be famous in Israel. Remind you of anyone? And then verse 15 says he's a restorer and a sustainer. Look at verse 17. We can almost hear the angels and the shepherds in the fields in our Christmas story. A son has been born. These are all foreshadowing Jesus. Not to mention, this little baby is born in Bethlehem. And I'll come back to the little hint at the genealogy there at the very end. But I want you to see a second insight. Let's call it God's countercultural methods. We see in verse 15, the women of the town who were originally gossiping, remember back in chapter 1, they're now speaking blessing over Naomi. And they say this incredible phrase that to Naomi, Ruth is better than 7 sons. Now, the reason that we hear that and we're not all getting goosebumps is because we don't know enough about this society. Remember, in this culture, to have sons meant everything. Only men had access to power. Only men could provide really true future security to a family. And so if you want to be comfortable into your old age, you better have some sons. And on top of that, 7 is the perfect number. And so this phrase, 7 sons, is synonymous really with a perfect family. And here's the significance. What we're seeing is God's countercultural provision. God turning upside down everything that society said was necessary for true happiness. And so in a society that said a full family is everything, God's joy showed up after the family got completely wiped out. In a society that said sons are everything, God provides through a pagan daughter-in-law. In a society that said your race is everything, God blesses a Moabite immigrant with an interracial friendship and an interracial marriage. Everything this culture said was necessary for true happiness, God came in and he circumvents through the life of one surrendered Moabite woman named Ruth. Now, sometimes God's journey to joy comes in a roundabout path, and some of you know this well. What would a modern countercultural equivalent be? Well, what does our society say is important for your happiness? Our society says, money is critical to happiness. And God says, I can bring joy even when you are lacking. Our society says having a great job is everything. And God says, I can bless you even if you're at the bottom rung of the ladder. Our society glorifies the self overall. And God says true joy comes when you're selfless, not when you're selfish. Our society says that your sexual identity defines your very identity and pleasure. And God says, I will provide perfect joy when your identity is fully in me. And so you see, God's joy operates outside the confines of what our society says is necessary for happiness. Here's the third insight that I want you to see. This is a little bit more granular, but we'll call it 71 words of symmetry. So the book of Ruth opens and closes with a little literary trick that original readers would have certainly noticed. But because most of us aren't fluent in ancient Hebrew, including me, we rely on scholars for this kind of information. But the first 3 verses of Ruth are exactly 71 Hebrew words. And in those first 3 verses, we feel the sum total. It's kind of a summary of Naomi's shattered dreams. The famine hit her homeland. She moved to Moab. Her husband and sons died. She faced heartbreak and heartbreak and heartbreak. Then the last 4 verses of this narrative that we just read, Ruth 4:13 to 17, are also comprised of 71 Hebrew words. This isn't just clever writing. This is God showing us that he's in the business of plot twists. The author is using this literary style of symmetry to show us kind of in code that in the beginning dreams are shattered, but by the end, dreams are restored. You see, God loves to take our worst chapters and turn them into our greatest testimonies. We're supposed to see that even when we lose everything, followers of Yahweh will gain everything in him. And so what started as Naomi's despair ended in Naomi's joy. This is the plot twist. But how? What does the road look like on the way from shattered dreams to that destination of joy? Well, our big idea today is this, that the journey from despair to joy is not straight, but it is sure. The road to joy for godly people is not like a desert highway through Nevada where you drive for days with nothing but sky and horizon. It's more like a mountain pass through West Virginia. There are rock slides and hairpin turns and blind corners and switchbacks going backward to move forward. And you can really never see very far ahead, but there are signposts all along the way that say, joy just ahead. And that's the path all of us who follow Jesus are on. And that's the path Naomi found herself on. In the beginning, her life was a mess. In fact, be sure of this. If you live long enough, your dreams will shatter. And at times you'll be confused and probably even furious with God. But as we arrive at chapter 4, Naomi is a woman who, after all the pain and all the grief and loss, she ends up with joy. Not the shallow happiness that most of us depend on just to get through a day. It was not that happiness that comes when life is cool and carefree. It was the joy of knowing a God who was moving through her life to accomplish his purposes and accomplish his purpose bigger than her. In fact, I just want to do a couple working definitions before we move too much further. Happiness means the good feeling that comes when life is going as you want. But joy is a deep satisfaction in knowing God no matter how life is going. And I remind you today that it's possible to know God in a way that generates a deep internal satisfaction even when your life is falling apart. You may be here today and you're like so consumed by your pain or your struggle or your stress that you've forgotten that you're on the road toward joy. And I pray that Naomi will speak to you today. I want us to look back at the whole book of Ruth, and I want to see Naomi going through some of these different stages of the journey. We're going to go back through and pull 5 phrases that kind of map her journey. These are signposts along the road, if you will. C.S. Lewis said this. He said, when we are lost in the woods, the sight of a signpost is a great matter. So we're going to look for some signposts today that point us toward joy and see from Naomi's perspective and try to answer this question. How can we find joy in a God that sometimes lets our dreams shatter? These are 5 signposts on the surprising journey toward joy. The first is depths of despair. Look back at chapter 1, verse 21. Naomi said, I went away full and the Lord brought me back empty. This is the moment Naomi reached her lowest point. She was bitter and angry and feeling sorry for herself. And she thinks, it's God's fault. He could have done something, but he did nothing. But notice in the sentence, who moved? Who left? Who walked away from whom? Was it God that left or was it Naomi that left? We find out he didn't leave. She's the one who, it says, went away. He was there all along waiting for her. She left him. Now, I realize that's not always the way it goes down. There are times when something hits us out of the clear blue that we had no control over and nothing to do with, and it can lead to incredible despair. A bunch of people around Grace have been blindsided recently with news or tragedy or diagnoses, and the despair can set in and it can linger, and darkness can become a constant, unwanted companion. And whether it was triggered by you walking away or not, when you're in a place of despair, it's hard to imagine and remember that you're on a journey toward joy. But it's important to keep in mind that joy is still up ahead for you, either in this life or the next. If you follow Christ, your story ends with joy. But in her despair, Naomi did the right thing. She made the right decision. She came back to God. And she was honest with the people when she got back. God can handle your honesty, and so can your life group or your mentor, your Christian friends or your spouse. The worst thing to do is to just pretend you're okay and fake it. But the depths of despair is where God begins to author his plot twist. Look at the very next verse, 1:22. And we'll see the second signpost, and that is hidden hope. We took note of this phrase. It says, at the beginning of the barley harvest. It's a reminder that there are subtle signs of hope along the journey, if you'll look for them. The tide was turning for Ruth and Naomi before they even knew it. That they thought they might starve, but unbeknownst to them, the first little sprouts of barley were popping out of the ground, even as they embarked on the 50-mile journey back to Bethlehem. If they had taken notice, God was already making a way. Those little sprouts of barley were about to write a whole new future script for their lives. And some of you, there are little glimpses of hope all around you, but you're so caught up in your bitterness, or you're so caught up in your pain that you can't see them. Maybe you're looking for answers inside yourself, but you haven't taken a moment to look outside yourself. Maybe your focus has been so much on what God has taken from you that you've forgotten to notice all the things that God has given to you. Maybe you've been scrambling so fast in your own strength, trying to solve your own problems, that you failed to slow down and hear him. See, sometimes we miss the hidden hope because we're moving too frantically. If you've ever flown into Erie on an airplane, you get a beautiful view of Presque Isle, the peninsula, from the air. But as breathtaking as it is from high above, traveling at a couple hundred miles an hour, you don't get to appreciate the details. You get a whole different appreciation of Presque Isle when you head out on one of the boardwalks and stand still for an hour, or see the wildlife coming and going, and you see that the petals of the flowers blowing in the breeze, and you see the subtle movements of the lagoons. My point is that speed and distance blur your ability to see the beauty that God has been up to. If you're fast and far, you're going to miss it. But if you're slow and close, if you slow down and lean in, you'll begin to see that there is hidden hope all around you. If you're having a hard time seeing it, can I recommend that a good trick is to gain the perspectives of some friends? Like, they may be able to see some things that you can't see. So the harvest is coming and the famine is ending, but the next turn in God's surprising story required them to act. To take action. It's the third signpost, which we'll call faith-driven effort. Look over at chapter 2, verse 2. Naomi is a woman of faith, but she and Ruth aren't sitting around and just waiting for God to do something. The two women will starve to death unless they get some food. And so in faith, they act. And Naomi says these words. Listen, she says, "Go, my daughter. Go, my daughter. Get out of here." She sends Ruth out into the fields to glean. Remember, the harvest has brought this hidden hope. And God has made a provision for his people that widows and immigrants can glean for food from around the edges of the field. Just because it's God's provision, though, you see, food doesn't magically appear from heaven. Their faith leads to strategic action. And as soon as they take action, God's invisible hand begins to move in the form of God's providence. These so-called divine coincidences. So she just so happens to wind up in Boaz's field. And really the rest is history. And as we read it again, knowing how the story ends, it's so painfully obviously what's happening. God is weaving the details of this story together in his sovereignty. And for those of you who are followers of Christ, can I remind you today that God is also weaving your story together in his sovereignty. God is at work behind the scenes. While you are feeling forsaken by God, God is at work. While your world is crashing down, God is at work. While you're struggling and questioning and crying out, yes, even then, God is at work. And so don't curl up in a ball. Get out there and do the next right thing. God doesn't steer parked cars, remember. He steers moving cars. And we always feel this tension, like, well, if God is writing the story, how much should I actually be doing? And how much is it God's responsibility to do? Like, if I step in and start doing stuff, does that mean I lack faith in God? And on the other hand, I don't want to be, just sitting around and being lazy. It's why I love this phrase, faith-driven effort. Faith-driven effort isn't trying to earn God's favor. It's responding to what you already know about God's character. See, Ruth didn't glean to make God love her. She gleaned because she trusted that God loved her first. So if you're paralyzed wondering, should I act or should I wait? Here's the answer. Do the next right thing that's right in front of you. When we move in faith, God's providential hand starts working in ways we never could have orchestrated ourselves. Some of you still have a step to take. And it may not lead to immediate relief from your struggle, but your faith-driven effort will activate God's providential hand in your life. And when your car starts moving, he starts steering. So the journey toward joy has involved depths of despair and hidden hope and faith-driven effort. And now comes perhaps the hardest part of any plot twist, the waiting, the space between God's up to something and God has made his ways clear. So look at chapter 3, verse 8 for the next road sign along our surprising journey to joy. And we'll call it patient perspective. See, after Naomi had encouraged Ruth to make some bold moves on Boaz last week, there was a moment where it looked like it still wasn't going to work out. Like they discover right at the end that there was another kinsman redeemer in line who might want to get involved. And when Ruth returns to Naomi and fills her in, Naomi offers this sage advice, and we see her perspective changing. See, she says in chapter 3, verse 18, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. The man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Guys, this is a far cry from being bitter and angry at God. It's even a noticeable step of faith from, get out there and work the fields. Naomi's saying, Ruth, we've done all that we can do. And now we must trust in the tenacity of our Redeemer. She says, we can rest in the fact that our Redeemer won't rest until his work is done. How many of you know that our Redeemer is relentless? The God who has the power to bless you, but is not blessing you the way you want. He is also not indifferent. Right now, Jesus isn't just like sitting back, taking a break from your story. He's actively working, preparing your future, orchestrating your rescue. And sometimes the most faith-filled thing that you can do is to rest in his relentlessness on your behalf. But it takes a patient perspective, which is really hard. Let's just admit it. It's really because we are an instant gratification people with a capacity for total self-absorption, fascinated by the present and fixated on the immediate. The decisions that are burdening me right now, the relationships that are dragging me down right now, the struggles that I'm experiencing right now, the stuff of life that appears to be so pressing right now. And the question is, when you finally reach the place where you've done all that you can do, does your heart panic or calm? Does your mind keep racing or do you surrender? These are the markers of a patient perspective. The Bible calls this perspective an eternal perspective. See, we have a long view about the future, and we set our hopes there. And as we do, our hearts move closer and closer to true joy. Woodrow Wilson had a great quote. He said, "I would rather lose in a cause that will someday win than win in a cause that will someday lose." You see, in the long view, we remind ourselves often that we are on the winning team. We remember that our Redeemer is tirelessly at work, and we take joy in that patient perspective, regardless of our circumstance. And so now we arrive at the climax of God's plot twist, the moment when Naomi finally sees what God was writing all along. Our last signpost is in chapter 4, verse 16. It's the bigger picture. And I want you to see this phrase again that we read just a moment ago. Then Naomi looked, it says, and the child laid him in her lap. And this is one of these beautiful full circle moments. Naomi holding her grandchild in her lap, blowing on his neck, squeezing his chubby little thighs, walking her fingers up his little belly, and she lays him on her chest, and as she gently rubs his back, he falls asleep, and she's in the rocking chair just smiling and thanking God that her life has been redeemed. The bigger picture has come into focus. This phrase, interesting phrase, on her lap, it occurs only 3 times in the Bible. Every time in Genesis, and each time it describes a patriarch, a matriarch holding an infant that will continue the larger story of God after that person is gone. See, this is the hidden key to joy. True joy comes when I understand that I'm not the point. There's a larger story being written. The startling truth is that God is committed to his story more than my story. To put it bluntly, God is committed to his glory over my comfort. And it's not because he's some egomaniac. Like, we both benefit from that arrangement. God knows that if you live for his glory, you're actually going to discover true joy. You see, the book of Ruth wants to teach us that God's purpose is to connect us to something far greater than ourselves. God wants us to know that when we follow him, Our lives always mean more than we think they do. And so even when bad things happen, we can frame them in a bigger picture frame. You lose your job. How might this advance God's kingdom? You walk through a family crisis. How can this serve God's glory? Now, I'm not saying not to feel pain or grief, or to not be human, or to use stupid Christian cliches to mask your real struggle. Heck, Naomi changed her name to bitterness for a while. But we must always remember the bigger picture and understand that the roundabout path to joy always reaches its pinnacle when we realize that the point of the whole story is God's glory. Look at the exclamation point in the book and the connection to an even bigger story in the genealogy of verse 18. Verse 18 says this of chapter 4. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Abinadab, and to Abinadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse David. Now, this conclusion would have stunned the original readers. This little boy born to Ruth and Boaz, laid in Naomi's lap, was named Obed. And in his old age, Obed would eventually become the doting grandpa of a little whippersnapper named David. Yes, giant-killing David. Yes, man after God's own heart, David. Yes, David, the one who leads Israel into its golden era as her greatest king. And yes, David, the one God promises that someday through his bloodline will come a Messiah who will rescue the world from their sins, the ultimate kinsman redeemer. When you hear all those Christmas prophecies that say a child will be born in the line of David, in the lineage of David. Well, David came through the lineage of Obed, the unlikely baby born to Ruth and Boaz, the grandson of bitter Naomi. And he would be born in this same little town of Bethlehem, the house of bread. Jesus Christ, the bread of life, born in the house of bread. This Jesus we worship has in his bloodline a hated Moabite woman who decided to leave her homeland to be loyal to her mother-in-law and to pursue the God of the Bible. Yes, she got a little bold next to a bag of grain with a rich dude. But even that detail is yet another reminder that Jesus came for everyone, not the perfect, not the buttoned up, not the ones who have it all together. And so as we close out this amazing book of the Bible, this incredible story, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. I just want you to imagine Naomi in this little final scene, holding a baby Obed in her lap. Picture her weathered hands holding this tiny baby, and for the first time in years, she's not thinking about her pain. She's marveling at this incredible plot twist. The God she thought had abandoned her had actually been weaving her story into the greatest rescue story ever told. Some of you are in the middle of a chapter that feels like it will never end. A diagnosis that rocked your world, a relationship that fell apart, a dream that died, a betrayal that still stings. And you're wondering if God sees you, if he cares, if there's any hope for a plot twist in your story. Here's what I need you to know. The same God who turned Naomi's bitterness into joy, the same God who used a foreign widow to save a family line, who took the darkest moments and made them the setup for a great comeback. That same God is writing your story right now. And you may not see it, and you may not feel it, but behind the scenes in ways that you can't imagine, God is preparing your plot twist. And when it comes, and it will come, you'll look back and see that every tear, every struggle, every moment of doubt was actually God setting the stage for something beautiful. As today's big idea says, the journey from despair to joy isn't straight, but it is sure. And the God who never rests until his work is complete is writing your story even now. So guys, as a next step today, will you reflect with me for a moment? Will you identify yourself along this journey toward joy? Like depths of despair, hidden hope, faith-driven effort, patient perspective, or bigger picture. Like, when you come up to one of those city maps in a park that says you are here, I would just ask you on this little map, where are you? And what is the next signpost that you need to be looking for? Like, are you in the depths of despair? Maybe you need to keep your eyes open for some hidden signs of hope. Or are you at the place where you've seen a glimmer of hope and now you need to be proactive in faith-driven effort? Or is it time for some patient perspective where maybe you can't see it just yet, but you have to rest in the fact that you've done all you can do and trust that God is at work behind the scenes? Or maybe you're experiencing some of the true joy of seeing the bigger picture, recognizing it's not about you, and sensing the role that you're playing in the bigger story of God. Would you ask God to help you see that next signpost on your surprising journey toward joy? And will you just pray a prayer of faith today as we close? Pray a prayer like this: God, please help me to trust your plot twists. Even when I can't see the ending you're writing. Let's linger there for just a moment. I love you guys.